When you open the New Testament, the first things you encounter are the four Gospels: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. But have you ever paused to ask yourself, who really wrote them? Were they actually penned by the people whose names appear at the top? Or are we reading stories assembled by anonymous authors decades after the fact? Hey everyone, welcome back to Internet Capsule, where history, mystery, and the ancient world collide. Today, we're diving deep into one of the most debated questions in biblical scholarship: who really wrote the Gospels? And why does it matter? In this episode, we'll break down the traditional view of Gospel authorship, explore modern scholarly critiques, and, most importantly, uncover 5 compelling reasons why the traditional authorship of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John still deserves serious consideration. So let's get into it. Reason 1: Early Church Testimony. Let's start with the testimony of the early Church. Long before academic scholars began dissecting biblical texts in the modern era, early Christian leaders had already attributed each gospel to a specific author. Take Papias, a bishop from the early 2nd century. He's one of our earliest sources. Papias claimed that Mark wrote down what Peter preached, and that Matthew compiled the sayings of Jesus in Hebrew or Aramaic. Then there's Irenaeus of Lyon, writing around 180 AD. He affirmed that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were the legitimate authors of the 4 canonical Gospels, and he wasn't alone. Other early Christian writers like Clement of Alexandria, Tertullian, and Origen echoed these views. So here's the question: if these names were just slapped onto anonymous texts much later, why do we see such early and consistent agreement on who wrote them? Wouldn't we expect more confusion, more disagreement, or more alternatives? That consistency across time and geography suggests that these names weren't arbitrarily chosen. They were tied to strong traditions from the very beginning. Reason 2: Unlikely author choices. Here's something you might not have thought about. If the early church wanted to fake authorship to boost credibility, they picked some really strange candidates. Let's think this through. Matthew? A tax collector, basically a traitor in the eyes of 1st century Jews. Not exactly a public relations win. Mark? He wasn't one of the 12 apostles at all. Why not attribute the second gospel to someone like Peter or James? Luke? Also not an apostle. He was a Gentile doctor who followed Paul. Again, not the most obvious choice if you're trying to add apostolic weight. And John? He was part of Jesus' inner circle, sure, but his gospel is so different in style and tone, it would have been risky to pin that on him unless there was real justification. In other words, if the names were fabricated, they weren't very strategic. Which makes it far more likely that these were actually the people who wrote, or at least inspired, these texts. Reason 3: Internal evidence in the Gospels. The Gospels themselves give subtle clues about their authorship, clues that line up with the traditional view. For instance, in the Gospel of Mark, there's an emphasis on vivid, eyewitness detail, especially surrounding Peter. That makes sense if Mark was writing down Peter's first-hand accounts. In Luke's introduction, the author admits he wasn't an eyewitness but says he carefully investigated everything from the beginning. That matches the idea of Luke the physician gathering reports, perhaps from Mary or the early apostles. John's Gospel contains phrases like, "the disciple whom Jesus loved," and ends with a statement that this disciple wrote these things. Many scholars agree this is John's humble way of referring to himself. These aren't smoking guns, but they do match what we'd expect if the traditional authors really were involved. The writing styles, themes, and perspectives all align with what we know about these 4 men. Reason 4: No competing claims in early Christianity. Now let's imagine for a moment that the authorship of the Gospels was up for grabs. You'd expect competing theories, right? But in the case of the 4 canonical Gospels, there aren't any serious early rival claims. No one in the early church says, "Actually, Thomas wrote the Gospel of Matthew," or "Luke was written by someone else entirely." In contrast, when you get to the Gnostic Gospels, like Thomas or Mary or Judas, you do see debates about authorship. That's because those texts were anonymous or pseudonymous, and the church was rightly skeptical. The total lack of controversy over Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John? That's unusual, and it speaks volumes. Reason 5. The manuscript evidence. Finally, let's talk manuscripts. Some of our earliest Gospel fragments, like the Rylands Papyrus, also known as P52, date to just a few decades after the original writings. And from the moment these texts appear in the historical record, they're already being copied, distributed, and cited with the same names we use today. Think about that. If the names were added later, we'd expect earlier versions of the texts without any author attribution. But that's not what we see. Instead, the titles, according to Matthew, according to Mark, and so on, appear consistently and early. There's no real trace of a time when these Gospels were floating around anonymously. That doesn't prove the names are correct. But it does make it far harder to argue they were added long after the fact. Alright, quick question for you. Before watching this video, did you believe the Gospels were actually written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John? Drop a comment below. We'd love to hear your thoughts. And while you're at it, hit that like button if you're enjoying the deep dive. It helps us reach more curious minds like yours. Now, to be fair, critical scholars raise valid points. Yes, the Gospels were likely written decades after Jesus' life. Yes, the authors didn't sign their names in the texts themselves. And yes, oral traditions played a huge role in how these stories were preserved. But here's the thing, none of that necessarily contradicts the traditional view. It's entirely possible for the evangelists to have written, or supervised the writing of, the Gospels based on both their memory and the testimony of others. And it's worth noting that even in the ancient world, writing through a scribe, or in collaboration with followers, was completely normal. So when we say, Luke wrote Luke, we're not saying he sat alone in a room with a quill for 10 years. It means he oversaw the creation of a text rooted in his perspective. Conclusion: why it matters. In the end, the question of gospel authorship isn't just a historical curiosity. It's about trust. If the Gospels were truly written by people who knew Jesus, or knew those who knew him, then they're not just ancient texts. They're eyewitness testimony. And while critical scholarship helps sharpen our understanding, it shouldn't automatically override centuries of tradition and internal evidence. So the next time you read a verse from the Gospel of John, remember, you may be hearing the voice of someone who actually walked beside Jesus, saw the miracles, heard the teachings, and passed it all down, not just as history, but as hope. Thanks for watching Internet Capsule, where we bring the ancient world back to life, one story at a time. Don't forget to subscribe, hit that bell icon, and share this video if you found it valuable. Until next time, stay curious.